She was there, kneeling, scrubbing the floor with an old rag, her labored breath fading into the long hallways of that forgotten asylum. Her hunched back seemed to hold more than years. She seemed to carry guilt, silences, unspoken memories. No one looked at her. None of the staff mentioned her. She was part of the background, like an antique piece of furniture that no one dares to throw away, but no longer belongs. I remember the smell of cheap disinfectant, mixed with the smell of stale breakfast bread still on the tables. I was standing in front of a window, accompanied by the director of the place, an elegant, smiling woman who chattered on and on about bed numbers, donation figures, and expansion plans. But I wasn't listening, because my eyes were fixed on her. That woman, that shadow. My heart pounded as if I knew something my mind didn't yet grasp. A feeling in my stomach, a stabbing discomfort, as if something inside me was about to explode. I was told the place was called Maple Hope, a nursing home in Knoxville, that it had been operating for over 40 years, that many residents had no family, that some died without anyone coming to say goodbye. I was told all of this, but no one told me that a ghost from my past lived within those walls. I don't usually get emotional easily. I'm all about data, codes, and numbers. I've been in boardrooms where fortunes are decided in minutes. I've seen investments worth hundreds of millions finalized with a simple signature. But in that moment, seeing that woman slide her knees on the floor, I felt something I'd never felt before. Panic. A primal fear. As if my soul had recognized something my memory had erased. Her hair was tied back in a simple bun. She wore white clothes stained by age and cleaning products. Her skin was brown, wrinkled, with deep marks on her elbows and hands. She looked older than she probably was. But her eyes, those eyes. Every time I glanced up briefly, something inside me snapped. There was something there, an echo, a presence I couldn't ignore. No one told me their name. No one seemed to notice my discomfort. Everyone was busy showing me figures, documents, budgets, and I, standing in the middle of that alien reality, felt like a child again, vulnerable, lost, caught between a past I couldn't remember and a present that suddenly no longer made sense. It was my first time in a nursing home. I'd never felt the need to visit one. My childhood had no grandparents. My adult life had no time to think about old age. But that day, on that visit planned as part of a public relations strategy for my company, something changed. Because that invisible woman seemed to know me, or I knew her, but I didn't know how. I watched as one of the residents offered her a cookie. She smiled sadly and accepted it, as if this small gesture was the closest thing to love she'd received in years. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The way she moved, the way she tilted her head, the way she folded the towels with an almost ritualistic precision, everything spoke to me. Everything struck me with a force I didn't understand. The director continued talking to me about the volunteer program, but her voice faded away. Because in my head, something was activating. Fragments, vague images, a scent of lavender, a song someone used to sing to me before bed, a warm hug, arms that held me when I had a fever, a sweet voice calling my name. For years, I was told that my mother had abandoned us, that she'd run off with another man, that she left me with my father when I was barely 6. I grew up with that version. I accepted it. I had no other. No one ever questioned that story, not even me. But now, in front of me, was a woman wiping the floor as if she wanted to erase her own existence. And something told me she wasn't a stranger. I can't explain the connection. I can't explain the trembling in my hands or the lump that formed in my throat. I can only say that in that instant, all the millions I had earned, all the accomplishments I had accumulated, all the power I had built were worthless. Because I was facing a truth that my soul recognized, but my mind refused to accept. Life has strange ways of confronting us with what we avoid. And that day, without knowing it, I was about to confront the deepest wound of my existence. A wound that had been falsely healed my entire life. A wound that began to bleed again, just with the touch of a glance. My breathing became labored. The room spun slightly. I tried to return to the present, to focus on the facts, the logic, what I knew, but everything blurred. Only she remained clear, as if the world had vanished, and only the two of us remained in that room filled with the past and chlorine. In a corner, I saw a small notebook, old, with worn edges. On the cover, hand-embroidered, was written, "To R.C. with eternal love." My blood ran cold. R.C. Those were my initials. Richard Collins. How was that possible? What was that doing there? Who had done it? Why? I approached without thinking. I took the notebook carefully. My fingers trembled. It was like touching a piece of my history, one I didn't know had survived, one that someone had silently kept for decades. The woman noticed. She looked at me for the first time, straight into my eyes. And in that look, I knew, without words, without proof, without logic, I knew she was my mother whom I thought was lost, my mother whom I had learned to hate through abandonment, my mother who had spent all this time scraping her existence in the halls of a place where no one saw her, except me, because in that moment, something inside me woke up, something that would never sleep again. My name is Richard Collins, 4 syllables that have appeared on the covers of business magazines, on lists of billionaires under 50, at exclusive conferences in Silicon Valley. 4 syllables that, for many, represent success, genius, discipline. But no one knows what those syllables hide, because behind that name is a boy who grew up with a lie tattooed on his soul. A boy who learned to build empires but never learned to embrace without fear. I'm 48 years old. I was born on the outskirts of Nashville in a small house with a wooden porch that creaked with every step. My father, a mechanic with heavy hands and even harsher words. My mother, well, that was the first thing stolen from me. Her image, her story, her voice. I always knew she existed, but only as a diffuse echo in the darkest corners of my memory. My father told me she'd abandoned us, that she simply left one night, that she didn't deserve a tear. I believed him. I was 6 years old. What else could I do? Every time I asked something about her, his face hardened and his fists clenched. I learned not to ask. I learned to keep quiet. I learned to grow up alone, surrounded by rusty tools, screams in the night, and silences that hurt more than any blow. School was my refuge, not because I was happy there, but because it was the only place where I wasn't yelled at. I always sat at the back, head down, notebooks spotless. I learned to disappear into the noise, to be invisible, to listen more than I spoke, and above all, to memorize every number, every word, every pattern. I had a mind that absorbed anything that wasn't emotional like a sponge. Emotions were dangerous. Data was safe. When I was 12, my father died in a motorcycle accident. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything. I just sat in front of the social worker who came to get me and told her I had nowhere else to go. They took me to a foster home. There, I shared a room with 3 other children, all with sadder stories than mine. One of them talked in his sleep, another wet the bed, and the third stole food at night. I just studied. It was there that Mrs. Rowley first saw me, a woman in her 50s, childless, with an inherited fortune and a penchant for adopting older children. She chose me, not because I was the friendliest, but because I was the quietest. She took me to her home, a stone mansion with double staircases and carpets that didn't get dirty. She gave me new clothes, a room with a garden view, and a personal computer. It was 1989. Having a computer at home was extraordinary. For me, it was like receiving a key to another world. I spent hours in front of that machine. I learned to program in BASIC, then in C, then in anything I could get my hands on. I didn't go out. I didn't speak. I didn't ask for anything. I just wanted to understand how that digital universe worked. where everything made sense, where there were no shouts or abandonments, where I was in control. Each line of code was another wall protecting me from the real world. Mrs. Rowley sent me to the best private schools. I excelled at every one, but I never made friends. I didn't trust anyone, not even her. Inside, I felt like if I let my guard down for even a second, everything would be ripped away from me again. So I built a suit of armor made of achievements, one after another. The medals, the diplomas, the scholarships. I was accepted to Stanford with a letter of recommendation signed by 3 professors who considered me a prodigy. And I was. But not because I was happy, but because I was afraid. Afraid of going back to being that kid no one wanted. In college, I founded my first company with 2 classmates. They believed in the American dream. I believed in necessity. We designed data management software that was acquired by a multinational for $10 million when I was just 21. That was the first time I saw more zeros than I could count, and yet I felt just as empty. With that money, I could have traveled, enjoyed myself, rested. But no, I invested everything. I founded a new company, bigger, more ambitious, an ecosystem of technological solutions for businesses of all kinds. I worked 16 hours a day. I slept at the office. I ate in front of my computer. I had no partner, no friends, no life. I only had goals and an endless list of things I wanted to accomplish, so I wouldn't feel the way I'd always felt. The media began to take an interest in me. The young genius, the CEO who didn't party, the low-key billionaire. I became a myth within the industry. But what no one knew was that every success was a form of punishment. I told myself that if I achieved enough, if I reached high enough, maybe one day the pain would go away. But it didn't. It just hid behind the numbers. He had houses in 3 cities, luxury vehicles, and shares in the world's largest companies. But he slept with a light on, because the absolute silence reminded me of my childhood. And in that silence, I sometimes heard her voice, soft, almost a whisper. A voice I couldn't place in time, but it hurt, because I had lost her. Because she had been taken from me. I've never had lasting relationships. I've dated intelligent, beautiful, successful women, but I put up an emotional wall around them all, impossible to cross. They told me I was cold, that I seemed to have everything except a heart. And they were right. I didn't know how to open up, how to trust, how to love without fear of being abandoned again. Some called me arrogant. Others called me a genius. I just felt lonely. In meetings, at events, in interviews, I was always surrounded by people. But inside, I was still that kid on the porch, wondering why his mom hadn't come back. I never went to therapy. I never talked about it with anyone. It was easier to bury it under numbers and achievements. For years, I believed that was life, that this was how the world worked, that one was born with a void and learned to fill it successfully. Until that day. The day I saw that woman in the nursing home. The day that entire wall that took me decades to build began to crack with a simple glance. Because no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't keep running away from the truth I had buried so deep. The truth always finds a way to come to light, even if it's through a stained uniform, from trembling hands, from a song you thought was forgotten, even if it's in the most unlikely place, in front of you, a few steps away, waiting to be recognized, and once you see it, you can't uncover it. You can't hide again, because the heart, no matter how armored, recognizes its source. It recognizes the love that was denied it, and in that instant, everything you thought you knew stops mattering, because what truly matters has just returned. There are memories that have no form but hurt, as if you lived them yesterday. Fragments that hide in the deepest folds of the mind. Broken pieces of a story no one wanted to tell you, but that the body remembers like wounds that never fully heal. That's what the image of my mother was like to me. Diffuse, imprecise, like a ghost that visited my dreams without a defined face, a voice, a song, a perfume I couldn't name, and an absence that was always there, floating, occupying space without asking permission. When I was a child, whenever I asked about her, my father responded with a mixture of rage and contempt. He said I was a coward, that she'd left because she couldn't handle the responsibility of being a mother, that she chose another life, another man, and left us behind without a second thought. He never gave me a full explanation, only poisonous fragments that embedded themselves like splinters under my skin. I remember one particular night. I must have been 7 years old. I approached him with an old photo I'd found among forgotten papers. It was a young woman with eyes similar to mine. I asked if it was her. My father snatched the photo from my hands, tore it to pieces, and told me that woman was dead to us. That was the last time I tried. From that day on, every time I heard the word mother on television, at school, or from other children, I felt a knot in my stomach. It was as if they were talking about a treasure everyone knew about, except me, a part of my soul that was missing. And the most painful thing was that, with no clear memories, I began to doubt that she had ever existed. Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe my childhood mind had created an ideal maternal figure to fill that void. Maybe she never existed at all. My father was a tough man, rustic, a survivor of life, as he said. I never knew if he was ever affectionate with anyone. With me, at least, he wasn't. I remember him more as a shadow than a presence. He spoke little, drank a lot. He would lock himself in the garage for hours, smelling of burnt oil and cheap cigarettes. Sometimes he would yell to himself, arguing with ghosts from his past. I learned to move silently, not to ask questions, not to get in the way. I became an efficient child. I did what was asked of me. I didn't cause any problems. I showed no emotion. At school, when special holidays like Mother's Day came around, I would pretend to be sick. I stayed home so I wouldn't have to watch my classmates making cards, writing letters, preparing songs. I remember once a teacher, not knowing my story, asked me why I didn't bring a picture of my mom for the mural. I told her she'd died. It wasn't true, but at the time, it seemed like a more compassionate lie than saying she'd abandoned me. For years, I lived trapped in that narrative. I accepted it as absolute truth because I had nothing to contrast it with. But deep inside me, there was something that didn't fit, something that rebelled against that story. Because no matter how hard I tried to hate her, I never could. No matter how many times I repeated her words, that she was gone, that she left us, there was a part of me that wanted to believe it wasn't true, that there was a reason, that it wasn't selfishness, that, perhaps, she had no choice. There's a moment from my childhood that I remember like a flash of lightning in the fog. It was a rainy afternoon. I was sick, feverish, wrapped in an old blanket on the couch. My father wasn't there. Maybe he was working. Maybe he was drinking. I don't know. But I remember feeling cold fingers on my forehead. Someone was singing a soft melody, in a language I didn't fully understand. I felt safe, cared for, as if for a moment the world didn't hurt. And then, I slept. When I woke up, I was alone. I always thought I'd dreamed it. But now, after everything, I'm starting to wonder if that was the last time she was with me. The funny thing is, I never saw her in my dreams as an adult. She was always young. She always had that same soft face, with sad eyes and a small smile, like someone who loves in silence. Sometimes I woke up with my heart racing, feeling like I'd held her close, that I'd touched her, that she'd come back. But it was just my mind, playing with the broken pieces of who I once was. As an adult, when I began to have power, access, and resources, it never occurred to me to look for her. Not for lack of means, but out of fear. Afraid of finding something that would confirm what I'd been told, that she had truly abandoned me, that she had rebuilt her life without me. that she never thought of coming back. It was easier to believe she was dead, because at least that way I could imagine that she had loved me. The truth is, I spent years nursing an open wound I couldn't name, a wound that made me distrustful, controlling, and distant. I became brilliant, but incapable of connecting. I had impeccable professional relationships, but non-existent personal ones. I never let anyone get too close, and when they tried, I made sure to cut the ties before it hurt. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone else leaving. A woman I dated for a while once told me something that left a lasting impression on me. She said I was like a beautiful but empty house, with expensive furniture, perfect walls, but no warmth, no soul. And she was right. I built an empire, but I did it with bricks of fear, with cement of abandonment. And all I achieved, deep down, was a desperate attempt to fill a void that only a truth could fill. And that truth was there, scrubbing the floor of a nursing home, invisible, silent, waiting for me to see it, waiting for me to see it, waiting for our paths to cross again after so many years, without words, without explanations, only with the recognition of a look that time couldn't erase. Because there are bonds that survive even the cruelest distance. Because the heart, even wounded, never forgets the one who gave it its first beat. When my father died, I didn't cry. I didn't shudder. I felt neither relief nor sadness, only a heavy silence that covered my chest like a wet blanket. I sat in front of his coffin in the town funeral home with my hands clasped, staring at a fixed point on the ground, while everyone else murmured prayers I didn't understand and offered hugs I didn't want. I was 12 years old, and in that moment, I understood that from then on, I was completely alone in the world. That's when Mrs. Rowley appeared, a tall, elegant woman with white hair pulled back and always red lipstick. She had lost her only son in an accident and, I was told, dedicated herself to giving opportunities to older children no one wanted to adopt. She wasn't looking for tenderness or games. She was looking for projects, broken stories that could be molded in her own way. And she chose me. Maybe because I didn't cry. Maybe because I didn't talk. Maybe because I already looked like an adult trapped in a child's body. He took me to his mansion in the hills of Franklin, Tennessee. A huge house with carpeted stairs, crystal chandeliers, and a library bigger than the school I'd attended. I had a bedroom just for me, with a private bathroom, a king-size bed, and, most importantly, a computer. A Gateway 2000, one of those that made a strange buzzing sound when it started up and came with interactive encyclopedia CD-ROMs. It was love at first sight, not because of the design or the technology, but because it was the first object that offered me answers without judgment, without shouting, without conditions. I became addicted to knowledge. I learned to program in BASIC and then Pascal. By the age of 14, I'd already created my first inventory system for Mrs. Rowley's kitchen. By 15, I was already being paid to fix the neighborhood networks. It was as if, instead of growing up with affection, I'd been fed lines of code, and so I grew strong. Not on the outside, but on the inside. Emotionally tight-lipped, intellectually ruthless. The private school I attended was full of children of politicians, businessmen, and local celebrities. I was the odd one out, the silent orphan who always got straight A's, who didn't go to parties, and who never spoke about his parents. They didn't bother me. They ignored me, and that indifference was perfect for me. I moved through the halls like an efficient shadow, collecting data, observing gestures, memorizing patterns of human behavior as if they were algorithms. While everyone else was talking about cars, concerts, and designer clothes, I was thinking about operating systems, network security, and software architecture. When I turned 17, Mrs. Rowley asked me what I wanted as a gift. I told her I wanted a bank account in my name and the freedom to invest online. She, accustomed to dealing with adults, wasn't surprised. She granted my request. With that money, I started gambling on underground forums, on gambling sites, on emerging platforms. I won, I lost, I learned. And one day, without really looking for it, I stumbled upon the opportunity that would change my life. It was 1996. A virtual friend, one of those I only knew by his username, told me about an idea, an intuitive interface to simplify email and task management in mid-sized businesses. We called it Syncboard. I designed the back end, he designed the interface. We didn't have an office or investors, just two teenagers and a vision. In less than a year, we had 8,000 users, then 40,000. Then, a takeover bid from a Silicon Valley firm for $10 million. I was barely 19 when I signed that contract. I did it alone, in a borrowed suit, in a room where everyone present was twice my age. I remember that, when it was over, they offered me champagne. I declined. I walked to the bathroom, locked myself in, and cried silently for almost an hour. Not out of happiness, but because it was the first moment in my life where I felt something truly belonged to me. With that money, I could have retired. I could have traveled, seen the world, bought houses, collected experiences. But I didn't know how to do any of that. So I returned to the only thing I understood: creating. In the following years, I founded my second company, this time more ambitious. An ecosystem of integrated solutions for operational efficiency in global companies. A cool name, an impeccable structure, a revolutionary product, and a work pace that destroyed any attempt at a personal life. I slept at the office. I lived on coffee, energy bars, and code. I hired the best talent from across the country. I offered them high salaries, creative freedom, and a zero-tolerance work environment. Some admired me, others feared me. Everyone knew I wasn't like the others. They never saw me truly laugh. They never saw me talk about my family. They never saw me celebrate a birthday. I was like a machine, precise, infallible, solitary. My reputation grew like fire in dry grass. They called me the silent genius, the young CEO who never gave interviews, but everyone wanted to meet. I was on the cover of Wired, Fast Company, Forbes. By the time I was 30, I had more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But I still woke up in the early mornings with a stifled scream, with the memory of a soft voice singing in my ear, a voice I didn't know had ever existed. I bought a house in Aspen, a cabin in the Hamptons, a penthouse in Manhattan, and I still slept with the light on, because I couldn't stand total silence. Because in that silence, memories returned, and in those memories, she was there, not as a defined presence, but as a void, like a page torn from the most important book in my history. I tried looking for her once. I hired a private investigator. I gave him the little information I had: name, hometown, estimated date of birth. He came back 2 months later empty-handed. He said he found no record of her after 1985, as if the earth had swallowed her up, or as if someone had taken it upon themselves to erase her. I paid him and never mentioned it again. I couldn't bear the thought that the final answer would be total oblivion. And yet, life led me back to her. Without seeking it, without planning it, in a place I never would have imagined. Because destiny has its own logic, one that doesn't understand money, status, or technology. And when it decides to put the pieces in place, it does so without asking permission. That morning, when I entered the nursing home with the director and the photographer from my team, I did so thinking of a simple photo shoot, one more social service, an extra point for the annual report. But what I found there was something that neither all my money nor all my ingenuity could have foreseen. It was the most brutal mirror I'd ever looked into, and also the beginning of a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about myself. The woman scrubbed the floor with a rhythm that wasn't mechanical, but almost ritualistic. Every movement of her hands seemed to contain a story, a suppressed lament, a silent plea to the universe. I watched her from the end of the hallway, not understanding why I couldn't stop staring. There was something hypnotic about her fragility, and it wasn't just her thin, hunched body, nor her white clothes stained with the remains of cleaning products, nor the grayish rag that crumbled between her fingers. It was something deeper, something that spoke to me without words, like an ancient whisper, like a language only the soul recognizes. I remember the exact moment he looked at me. It was a split second. His eyes met mine, and something inside me snapped. It wasn't a conscious recognition. It wasn't an immediate certainty. It was a jolt, like when you hear a song you didn't know you knew, and yet every note seems part of you. I shuddered. I had to pretend to check my phone to hide the trembling in my hands. The air grew thicker, the hallway grew longer, and I became smaller. The nursing home director continued talking, oblivious to my disengagement. She explained that this woman had worked there for years, that she had no family, that she volunteered to help with cleaning in exchange for lodging, that she never asked for anything, that she was quiet, reserved, but extremely dedicated. She told me that some people called her Margie, that others didn't even know her name, that she sometimes went weeks on end without uttering a single sentence. Margie, that diminutive fell upon me like a thunderclap, because that was the name that appeared, almost erased, in the corner of the torn photo my father destroyed when I was a child. Margaret Collins. My mother, the name I learned to keep quiet, the name I never said out loud again. I felt as if the world had stopped, as if all the background noise had suddenly become a distant hum. My legs began to weaken, but I couldn't show weakness. Not there. Not in front of the director, the photographers, the employees waiting for her courteous greeting and generous CEO smile. So I took a deep breath, swallowed, and pretended to follow the visit as if nothing were happening inside me. Meanwhile, every furtive glance at that woman confirmed what my mind still refused to accept. She didn't seem to recognize me, not as her son. She watched me with a mixture of curiosity and distance, as if I were just another visitor. But in her eyes, there was a shadow of something that wasn't indifference, something that seemed to hold an entire ocean of unanswered questions. I wanted to approach her. I wanted to talk to her, but I didn't know what to say. How do you start a conversation with the woman who gave you life and whom you thought was dead for more than 30 years? The opportunity arrived. During lunch, I discreetly retreated to the backyard. I needed air. I needed to think, and there she was, sitting on a bench, hands on her knees, staring up at the gray sky. She didn't see me coming. I walked slowly. I sat down a few feet away. My heart pounded like a mad drum. Several minutes passed in silence, only the sound of a gentle breeze rustling the dry leaves. Finally, I worked up the courage to say something. I didn't know whether to start with his name. I didn't know whether to ask him if he remembered me. So I said the only thing that was on my mind, that perfume. She turned her head slowly, without surprise, as if she'd been expecting those words. She looked at me and answered in a low voice, broken by age. "It's lavender. I've always liked it." And in that moment, I was 5 years old again. I was back in my bed, tucked in, smelling that fragrance, while a soft voice sang in my ear. Tears began to fall without permission. I covered my face with my hands. I couldn't stop the trembling. I couldn't understand how it was possible that, after so much time, such a tiny detail was what brought me back to her. She didn't say anything else. She just looked at me, with that look that needs no explanation, as if she knew I wasn't ready to hear the whole truth, as if she knew that just being there in front of her was too much for one day. I returned to the hotel that night without speaking to anyone. I didn't want to eat dinner. I didn't answer any calls. I locked myself in my room and sat in front of the window. It was raining. The city seemed suspended in a state of waiting, as if the universe had given me permission to cry for the first time in decades. In the early morning, without knowing why, I took out a piece of paper and began to write. Not an email, not a report, not a strategy. I wrote a letter. The first emotional letter I ever wrote. I didn't sign it as CEO. I didn't mention numbers, achievements, or titles. I just wrote like a son who never stopped needing his mother. I told her I'd searched for her, that I'd hated her, that I'd cried for her, that I'd dreamed about her, that I'd forgiven her without knowing if I deserved to do so, that I'd forgiven myself for not having searched for her sooner, and that, if there was still something left between us, I wanted to rebuild it, even if it was with the pieces that time couldn't destroy. The next morning, I returned to the nursing home. I entered alone. No cameras, no equipment, no protocols. She was right in the hallway, kneeling, scrubbing. I approached slowly. I left the folded letter on a cleaning cart. I said nothing. I asked no questions. I just looked into her eyes and waited. She took the letter. She put it in her apron pocket without opening it. And for the first time since I'd seen her, she smiled. It wasn't a wide smile. It was a faint line, barely perceptible, but enough, because in that line, there was a world, one we were only just beginning to rediscover, one that, despite everything, still had life. From that day on, something inside me changed. It wasn't immediate or glorious. There was no background music or divine revelation. It was more like a crack that slowly begins to widen and, noiselessly, threatens to split everything apart. A crack through which the version of myself I had held for so many years escaped. The man who thought he had control, who had turned silence into armor, who had buried the past under numbers and contracts. That man could no longer stand before the woman who scrubbed floors with the same hands that had once cradled me. I spent the next few weeks immersed in a kind of emotional fog. I couldn't concentrate at work. Meetings seemed irrelevant. Executive decisions, urgent and cold, lost meaning compared to the fact that my mother was alive, that she had lived miles away from me for years, and that I had passed by her like a stranger. I began visiting the nursing home frequently, no longer as part of a social program or to comply with image protocols. I went alone, without an agenda, without cameras, just to be close to her, to observe her, to learn from her. It was then that the small details began to speak to me with devastating force. The first day, I noticed her hands, for example. Her fingertips were cracked, her skin was dry, weathered by cleaning products and time. There were small scars that formed irregular patterns on the surface, like maps of a hard life. I wondered how many floors she had mopped, how many dishes she had washed, how many times she had knelt in silence while the world continued to turn, unseen. One afternoon, I approached her as she watered the plants in the nursing home's backyard. I asked if she needed help. She looked at me as if that question hadn't been asked in decades. Then she lowered her head and offered me a small watering can. I took it without saying anything and sat down beside her. We watered in silence for several long minutes, and when the water was gone, she spoke to me. "I like things that grow slowly," he said, "because they don't owe anything to anyone. Only to time and care." That phrase stuck with me, because it spoke of her, of what she had done with her life, of how, instead of demanding justice or revenge, she had clung to routine, to anonymous work, to fertile silence. She had survived without asking anyone's permission, without stealing space, without making a sound. And yet, there she was, standing, alive, strong in her own way. Over time, I began to get to know her through others. The nurses told me that, although she didn't speak much, she always had a kind demeanor, that she knew exactly which nursing home resident was afraid of sleeping alone and would offer to watch the hallway in the early mornings, that she made soup when someone had a fever, that she knitted scarves in the winter and left them on the doorsteps of those without family to visit them. One of them said something to me that pierced my heart. "That woman has saved more lives with a rag and a smile than many doctors in white coats." It was impossible not to think about how unfair fate had been to her, how someone so essential had gone unnoticed for so long, how her presence had been ignored, when in reality She was the silent linchpin holding that place together. I began to notice that, in the hallways, workers would step aside when she passed by. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Like someone giving way to someone carrying more weight than they see. And the more I got to know her, the harder it became to understand her story. How she'd ended up there. Why she'd never looked for me. What had really happened after that night when she disappeared from my life. Every day, I felt a greater need to know, but also a sense of fear, because part of me feared the answer would be painful, that there was something unforgivable, that her silence hid a truth too harsh. One night, I found her in the nursing home kitchen, peeling potatoes. She was alone. Only the sound of the knife against the wooden board broke the silence. I approached and sat across from her. I asked if I could help. She offered me another potato without looking at me. We began working in sync. When I finished the third, I broke the silence. "Why did you never come back?" She stopped the knife. She placed it carefully on the table. She didn't look at me immediately. She seemed to be searching for the right words. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so soft that I had to lean in to hear her. "Because they told me you were better off without me. Because they made me believe I was a danger to you. Because I had no way of proving myself wrong. Because they broke me inside and tore me to pieces. And when I wanted to go back, it was too late. Your father threatened me. They took everything from me, even my name. They hospitalized me. They medicated me. They erased me. I froze. I felt like the whole room was crumbling around me. My father. That man who had raised me with an iron fist, who made me believe she was the one to blame, who repeated for years that the woman who brought me into the world had abandoned us out of cowardice. He had been the executioner, the jailer, the architect of a lie that marked me for life. She looked at me then, and there was no hatred in her eyes. There was pain, yes, but also acceptance. As if she had lived with the wound for so long that it no longer hurt. As if she had learned to breathe with her broken soul. I tried, Richard, for years, but they wouldn't let me. And when I finally left the place where they held me, you were gone, and no one would tell me where they'd taken you. I brought my hands to my face. I felt shame, guilt, anger, and above all, immense sadness, because all that time we lost couldn't be recovered. Because, while I was building walls, she survived in shadows, and because the only person who should always have been in my life was silenced by others. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked aimlessly through the city, my eyes swollen and my soul shattered. I thought about everything that could have been, about birthdays without her, about the achievements we didn't share, about the wounds we didn't heal together. But I also thought about what could still be, because she was still alive, and so was I. And maybe, just maybe, we still had time to start over, even if it was from scratch, even if it hurt, even if the past never went away. Because sometimes, that's what love is, choosing to look at the other not for what they were, but for what they can still be. And in that moment, I was willing to choose her, my mother, for the first time, without fear. Seeing her again after that conversation was like looking at a flower that had sprouted in the crack of a ruined building. Not because everything was repaired, not because the pain had gone away, but because in the midst of the emotional disaster, something had begun to live, something tender, fragile, and brave. My mother was no longer just the woman with the rag and the lavender. She was an interrupted story that was beginning to be written again with trembling hands and thick ink. We looked at each other differently, like someone who recognizes not with their eyes, but with their soul. And although the words were few, the silences began to have a different flavor. They were no longer barriers. They were bridges. I became obsessed with piecing together her story, with knowing every detail they'd kept from me. Not out of morbid curiosity, not out of idle curiosity, but because I needed to rewrite my own identity, to understand where I came from, what had really happened the night she disappeared from my life. I hired a different investigator. This time, the best. A man accustomed to cold cases, buried files, and manipulated stories. I gave him all the facts. I told him the truth, not as a businessman, but as a son. And I asked him for one simple thing. Don't tell me what I want to hear. Tell me what no one wanted to tell me. The weeks of waiting were like a second period of mourning. I prepared for the worst, for truths that could fracture my fragile reconciliation. But also, deep down, I wished with all my might that the threads would begin to fall into place, that everything my mother told me in that kitchen would be backed up by documents, testimonies, and records. Because if someone like her had lived so long in silence, she deserved for her voice to finally be heard. The report arrived in a blue folder, heavy, hundreds of pages, photos, transcripts. I locked myself in the house. I closed the curtains. I turned off the phone. And I read for hours, my heart sinking. I learned that my father had falsified medical reports to declare that my mother was having psychotic episodes. I learned that he convinced a psychiatrist friend to admit her without a real evaluation. That for 2 years she was medicated with powerful tranquilizers, isolated, with no visitors, no phone calls. I learned that by the time she left the psychiatric hospital, my custody had already been transferred, and that, through influence and money, he had managed to erase his tracks from all legal documents. There were complaints that were never investigated, letters she wrote that were intercepted, petitions that were archived. A whole life silenced by power, by rage, by the ego of a man who couldn't bear to be left behind. Because that was what hurt me the most to know. That my mother didn't abandon us, that she wanted to leave him, not me. That she wanted to save us both, and that he'd turned that into punishment. I cried like never before. I screamed. I pounded the table. I felt guilty for having believed all those lies, for having repeated my father's narrative in my mind so many times that it became law. But I also felt something new, a deep compassion for that child I had been, for that child who didn't know, who couldn't know, who did what he could with the truth he was given. I mentally hugged that broken child and told him he was no longer alone, that now he had answers, that now he could forgive and heal. I took that folder to the nursing home. I wanted to show it to her, not as proof, but as an act of justice, as if to say, here's your truth, here's your story. You're not crazy. You never were. You're not alone. She wouldn't touch it. She just looked at me and said, thank you, but not with her voice, with her eyes. And in that gesture, I understood that sometimes justice doesn't need noise, that there are silences that heal more than 1,000 speeches, and that my mother had learned to live without needing the world to acknowledge her pain. That just because I knew, just because I was there, was enough. From then on, I began looking for ways to repair, not with money, not with luxuries, with presence, with time, with details. I bought her a comfortable chair for her corner of the garden. I brought her large print books, reproductions of old records I used to listen to as a youth, a small radio that only tuned to classical stations. I brought her her favorite dessert, apple and cinnamon tart. The first time she tasted it, she closed her eyes and said she hadn't felt something so warm in years. I closed mine too, and in that sweet bite, we both began to erase the scars on our souls. One day, she invited me into her room. A small room with light-colored walls, a single bed, and a shelf filled with simple objects. There, she showed me a cardboard box. Inside were memories, scraps, torn photos, a baby blanket she'd managed to save, letters she'd written to me but never got around to sending, drawings of mine from childhood, my first tooth. She handed them to me one by one, as if she were giving me back parts of myself that had been taken from me. Each object was a silent testament to love, to resilience, to a motherhood lived in the shadows but never abandoned. I invited her to live with me, I told her she could leave the nursing home, that I had a house ready, comfortable, with a garden, with privacy, with everything she deserved. She refused. She said this place was her home, that she felt useful there, that she had her people, that she wanted to stay, not as a prisoner, but as a beacon, as a shelter for others. It hurt me, but I understood, because that was her. A woman who had been invisible for so long that, when she finally found her place in the world, she didn't want to give it up. So I built her a new garden, a small house on the nursing home grounds, a corner just for her, where she could continue to help, but with dignity, with respect, with her name on the door, Margaret Collins, mother, survivor, light. And every time I visit her, I find her surrounded by life, by people who embrace her, by flowers that bloom, by old people who look to her like a mother. And I, at her side, no longer feel like an orphan. I feel like a son. I feel like a man. I feel free, because in her voice, I found my origin. In her silence, the truth, and in her embrace, everything I needed to know who I am. The first time I took my mother to where I lived, it wasn't to convince her to stay, but to show her the world I'd built in her absence. A spacious but understated house, surrounded by trees, with huge windows that let in light from every angle. She walked slowly through the hallways, as if each step meant traversing a part of my story. She delicately touched the furniture, looked at the books lined up on the shelves, and took a deep breath when she reached the interior garden, where she'd planted lavender years before, unaware that the scent would one day bridge the gap between two worlds separated by oblivion. I offered her coffee. She accepted it. She drank it without sugar, the way I remembered her liking it as a child. She sat on the terrace, and I sat across from her. For a moment, we said nothing. There was no need to. There was something in the air that spoke volumes, as if the weather had finally decided to give us a break. She looked at the plants, the fountain, the stones on the path, and then she looked at me. Her eyes held a peace I had never seen before, as if she finally knew she had arrived somewhere safe. She asked me if I was happy. It took me by surprise. I'd never been asked that question so directly. I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I'd never stopped to think about it. I told her I was successful, that I'd achieved many things. She shook her head. I didn't ask you that. I asked if you're happy. I didn't know what to say. Because at that moment, I realized I'd spent my entire life building an empire to fill a void, that every achievement, every figure, every acquisition had been a desperate attempt to cover the wound of her absence, and that now that she was back, the silence was no longer filled with money. It was filled with her presence, with her voice, with her stories. From that day on, our meetings became rituals. I went to the nursing home every week, sometimes twice. I brought her small things, flowers, magazines, dark chocolate. She waited for me with mint tea and a free chair next to her. Sometimes we talked for hours. Other times we just shared silence. But every time we saw each other, I felt something inside me being rebuilt, as if each visit healed an old seam. She told me stories from her childhood, from her parents, from a field where she used to run barefoot, from a doll her mother gave her that she lost in a storm, from the time she learned to swim in a lake that no longer exists. From the first time she saw me, she told me that when they placed me in her arms, she felt like the world had meaning, that her life, finally, had direction, and that she never wanted to leave, that every night, in that hospital where they locked her up, she closed her eyes and thought of me, of my voice, of my footsteps, of my laughter, that it was that which kept her alive, not the hope of getting out, but the memory that I existed. Sometimes I found it hard to believe everything she had endured, but just watching her walk down the halls of the nursing home, her steps firm, was enough to know that her story wasn't one of defeat. It was one of resilience, of a dignity that didn't break, even when everything else did. One day I took her to a radio interview I was having. not as a guest, but just so she could accompany me. She sat behind the glass, wearing headphones, and listened as I talked about leadership, innovation, and social responsibility. As we left, she took my arm and quietly told me she was proud of me. Not for what I said, but for how I said it. Because there was truth in my voice. Because I was finally speaking from a more human place. And she was right. I wasn't the same anymore. I began to change. Not radically, but profoundly. Decisions at the company stopped being cold. I began to look at people beyond their titles, to listen more, to delegate, to trust. We started a psychological support program for employees, a foundation for women victims of domestic violence, a project to reintegrate older adults into the workforce. All of this was her idea. She didn't say it as a suggestion. She just told me stories of women from the nursing home who had been teachers, cooks, seamstresses, women with knowledge that no one valued. And I understood that the world needed those voices, that there was no wisdom more powerful than that which had survived abandonment. One afternoon, as we walked through the nursing home garden, he said something to me that changed me forever. Richard, pain doesn't fade. It transforms. And if you let it, it can become a guide. But if you hide it, it becomes a shadow. That phrase has stayed with me ever since, because I realized that my life had been a flight, a constant race to avoid the void, and that now, finally, I could stop. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer alone. I had my mother. I had her stories. I had the chance to truly start living. Little by little, I realized I didn't need anything else. That luxury, prestige, and record-breaking numbers were no longer the measure of my worth. That my true success lay in being there, with her, under the same sky, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence that so often seemed unbearable. And in that silence, I found something I'd never imagined. Peace. A peace made of lavender, clean sheets, warm soup, and firm, wrinkled hands. A peace that can't be bought. It can only be received. And I, after so many years, was finally ready to receive. There was something about the mornings I shared with my mother that became a kind of secret ritual between us. She would arrive early, before the nursing home had fully awakened. At that hour, the world still held no weight. She was already on her feet, always. Sometimes watering plants, sometimes arranging chairs, sometimes simply looking out the window with a cup in her hand. I would approach without saying anything. She would give me a soft look, and then everything was fine. We started writing letters, not to send them, just to read them to each other. It was her idea. She said she'd spent so much time bottling up words that now she needed them to come out, even if it was on paper. Every week, she'd hand me an envelope folded in 4, with her neat, slanted handwriting. I did the same. I told her things about my childhood I thought I'd forgotten. She told me things about her life before I was born. It was like looking through a mirror that showed not only what we'd lived through, but what we could never experience together. Those letters were more than memories. They were bridges, paths that brought us closer, word by word. He once wrote to me that life had taught him not to expect anything from anyone, that it had been his way of surviving. But I had changed that for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to wait. And not just anything, to wait for the sound of my voice, the touch of a hug, to share a cup of coffee without having to justify his presence. That broke me inside, because I understood how much pain fits into the routine of someone who was forgotten, and how healing it can be to simply be. I began to notice small changes in myself, almost invisible details. I no longer answered emails while walking. I no longer hung up calls out of boredom. I was no longer bothered by silence. All of that changed because she taught me to be present, to look, to smell, to touch, to let things hurt without hiding them under excuses. It was as if she were teaching me to be human again, and she did it without big words, just with her way of being. One Sunday afternoon, I took her to a park. It wasn't a special place, just a quiet space with tall trees and wooden benches. We walked slowly. She asked me to stop in front of a pond. She gazed at the water in silence, and she told me that when she was a child, she dreamed of having a house near a lake. Not for luxury, but for the sound of it. She said the water calmed her, that it made her feel less alone. I asked her if she still wanted it. She looked at me and said no, that she already had everything she wanted. A place where she wasn't invisible, a voice calling her mother, and peace. That word, peace, spoken by her, it had a different meaning, a different meaning. I asked her if she forgave me. She looked at me for a long time. She said there was nothing to forgive, that children aren't guilty of adults' decisions, that she too had made mistakes, that her silence was a prison, and that we had both paid a heavy price. But the beautiful thing was being there, together, without debts, without unfinished business, just two tired souls finally finding each other. We returned to the nursing home at dusk. The sky was painted orange and blue. She took my arm. She told me that every time the sky turned like that, she felt like the world was wrapping its arms around her, as if the universe was telling her she'd endured enough, that she could rest now. I asked her if she wanted anything else, some unfulfilled wish. She thought for a moment. Then she said she'd like to go back to the house where she was born, see if it was still standing, if the magnolia tree was still there. I promised I'd take her, not knowing yet how, but certain that I would. In the following days, I searched records, old maps, spoke with local authorities and residents of the town, and I found the house. It was still standing, abandoned, half in ruins, but there. I called a restoration team. I asked them not to change anything essential, just to clean, to leave the essence intact, to leave the tree untouched. It took weeks, but the day came. I drove her without telling her. It was a long trip. In the car, she stared out the window, not knowing where we were going. When we arrived and she saw the rusty gate, her hands shook. She got out slowly. She walked as if treading on sacred ground. She stopped in front of the wooden gate. She placed her hand on it. She closed her eyes, and she cried. Not a loud cry, a calm cry, deep, as if each tear were a memory released. We walked inside. The floors creaked. The air smelled of history. She touched each wall as if caressing a part of herself. She showed me where her bed was, where her mother cooked, where her father told her stories. She told me that's where she learned to pray, to sing, to dream. We sat under the magnolia. The tree was still blooming. She picked one and held it like a diamond. She said she never thought she'd be there again, that it was like closing a circle, like being reborn. We slept there that night, on makeshift mattresses, with candles lit. We talked until we fell asleep, and at dawn, I was awakened by the sound of birds, and his voice singing a melody I didn't know. It was a song his mother used to sing to him. He taught it to me. I learned it, and I recorded it on my phone, so I'd never forget it. Returning from that trip was like returning with a stronger soul, as if something that was broken had finally been mended. And although I knew there were still stories left to tell, wounds to understand, I felt like the essentials had already been said. That my mother, that woman who had once been invisible to the world, now shone with a light that neither abandonment nor time could extinguish. And I, finally, was witness to that, not as a businessman, not as an adult, but as the son who, after losing everything, had found the most important thing, his origin, his truth, his mother. Returning to my routine after that transformative trip with my mother was like trying to fit a new piece into an old puzzle. Nothing fit the same. My perception of time, priorities, and the people around me had changed. The same office hallways, which once conveyed power and control, now seemed cold. The meetings I used to lead with a firm tone and measured words felt empty if they didn't stem from a more human truth. I could no longer hide behind titles or metrics. I had discovered the root of abandonment and the power of forgiveness. I was no longer the same. One morning, while making coffee in my kitchen, I looked out the window and saw her sitting in her corner of the nursing home garden. The distance between my house and her small space had become symbolic. A journey that once represented years of ignorance and separation was now a sacred bridge I crossed with devotion. I took 2 cups of coffee, covered them with napkins to keep them warm, and walked over to her. I found her silent, caressing an old notebook. I asked her what she was writing. She replied that she was putting together her own book, that she wanted to leave something written, not for the world, but for me, so that when she was gone, I could still hear her. I asked her to read something. She handed me a page. It was a description of me, but not as a businessman, as a son. She talked about my childhood smile, about how I looked at her when I had a fever, about the times I fell asleep on her chest. She told me that was the true legacy, not what one builds outside, but what one sows in others. I remained silent, because that phrase needed no reply, only gratitude. We began recording our conversations. I put them on a small tape recorder I always carried with me. I wanted to document her voice, her pauses, her laughter. Every word was a testament, a living archive of love. Some afternoons, she told me stories I never would have imagined, like the time she sold her only pair of shoes to buy me some medicine when I was a baby, or the day she wrote my name on the fogged-up glass from the window of the psychiatric hospital, just so she wouldn't forget it. I didn't know what to do with so much history. It overwhelmed me, and at the same time, it rebuilt me. I began to dream of taking those memories further, creating something that spoke of her, of all the women like her, invisible, silent, strong. I thought of a documentary, a series, a book, but she stopped me. She said she didn't want fame. She just wanted me to know that it was enough that her voice not be lost in me. That if one day I had children, or nephews, or simply wanted to tell a true story, I could speak of it with pride. That night, I cried alone in my room, because I understood that the most valuable thing he had given me wasn't his forgiveness or his presence. It was his truth, a raw, simple, unadorned truth, a truth that many never receive in a lifetime. And I had it there, sitting in front of me every afternoon with a cup of tea and a gaze that had seen more pain than any soul should ever bear. A week later, we organized a small celebration at the nursing home. It wasn't a conventional party. It was a tribute. I invited the people closest to her, residents, nurses, cooks. I asked each of them to bring something that represented what she had given them. A word, an object, a letter, anything. And that day, the room filled with tears, stories, and soft laughter. A man who never spoke took the microphone only to say that she restored his faith. A woman with advanced Alzheimer's disease repeated her name 3 times as if it were engraved in her soul. A child, the son of one of the nurses, gave her a drawing of her as a tree with roots that touched everyone's hearts. My mother cried, but not from sadness, from recognition. For the first time in her life, she wasn't a shadow. She was a presence, a root, a beacon. And I, in a corner, unable to say much, felt that it was all worth it. That every penny earned, every obstacle overcome, every sleepless night made sense just by seeing her there, surrounded by true love. Not the kind you buy, but the kind you forge. After that night, something changed in the community as well. The nursing home was no longer just a waiting area. It became a memorial center. We began a project to collect the stories of each resident. My mother was the first to write hers. She titled it simply, "I Was a Silent Mother." Her text opened the door for others to speak. Stories came to light. Women who were artists, men who built schools, people who raised entire generations without applause or medals. And all of it thanks to her. The most surprising thing was that, without intending to, she became a symbol, an example. Many young people began visiting her to listen. They brought her questions, asked her for advice. She received them calmly. She never imposed. She simply spoke, as if her voice had the gift of touching what was dormant. And in each encounter, I learned something new about her, about life, about myself. It was then that I understood something I had sought for years. True success is not being remembered for what one did, but for how one made others feel. And my mother, without speeches, without titles, without stages, had made everyone feel at home. As if belonging were possible even after forgetting. As if love, when it's real, always finds its way back. And I, lucky one among millions, was a living witness to that. Because the woman who cleaned the forgotten halls now lit up everyone's hearts, including mine. Every day I spent with my mother made it clearer to me that true miracles don't always come with bright lights or applause, but in tiny, almost invisible gestures. Like when she would approach an elderly woman who had stopped speaking and brush her hair with gentle hands, singing a song only the two of them understood. Or when she would sit next to a man with Alzheimer's and tell him made-up stories just to make him smile, even if it was for a few seconds. There was a tenderness in her manner so pure, so real, that one couldn't help but feel transformed. I began to document everything, not for show, but to preserve what she unwittingly created. I bought a discreet camera and recorded fragments of her days. How she cut flowers, how she arranged blankets, how she left notes for the nurses thanking them for their work, how she wrote random verses on napkins when she thought no one was looking. All of this was part of an emotional map I needed to preserve, because I knew time wouldn't stand still. That, even though her voice was steady now, and her steps still sure, there would come a time when her body would begin to give way, and I didn't want to waste a single second of that rebirth. One night she asked me to help her organize her things. We went into her small room together and opened boxes she hadn't touched in years. There were blurry photos, wrinkled letters, newspaper clippings, and a hardbound notebook she had treasured. She handed it to me. It was her diary. Not a conventional one. It wasn't written in an orderly or chronological order. Rather, it was an accumulation of loose thoughts, deep reflections mixed with memories, intimate confessions, pain written without anesthesia, and also love, a lot of love. I read a page where she described how she felt about her first cry. She said it sounded like a promise, like a warning to the world that I was alive and coming to change everything. I closed the notebook with tears in my eyes. It was the most raw and beautiful testimony anyone had ever given me. I proposed publishing that diary, editing it carefully, sharing her truth with other women who had been silenced. At first, she refused. She said she wasn't a writer, that it wasn't for her. But over time, she understood that her story could heal others. We agreed to change names, to protect the intimate, but to maintain the essence. And so, a new project began, one that brought us even closer. We spent entire afternoons reading excerpts, correcting sentences, adding notes, rewriting what the world had tried to erase. The book was published months later. We titled it, "Where No One Looked for Me." It was a tribute to all the women who, like her, survived in silence. We didn't expect a great impact, but the impact was immediate. We received hundreds of letters, women telling their own stories, children recognizing their mothers in those pages, people who for the first time dared to speak out. My mother began receiving visits, calls, invitations to interviews, which she always declined with a shy smile. She said her work was done, that she didn't need more, that the echo of her voice had already been sown. One afternoon, when I arrived at the nursing home, I found her sitting in her favorite corner, gazing at the sky with a serenity that took my breath away. She told me she had dreamed of her mother, that in the dream she had told her it was time, not with sadness, with sweetness, like a mother calling her daughter home after a long day. She took my hand. Her skin was cooler than usual, her eyes brighter. She asked me only one thing, that when the time came, I wouldn't allow her story to be locked in a coffin, that I keep telling it, that I share it with whoever needed it, that I make it grow. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, thinking about all she had given me, what she had meant to me and to so many. I thought about how I had met her twice, once when I was born, once when I found her, and that both times she had been home. I thought about how she had given me back a sense of belonging, how she had taught my soul to breathe again, and how, through pain, she had sown beauty. A few days later, during one of our short walks through the garden, she stopped in front of a flower, a white rose. She touched it gently, and she said something I'll never forget. The strongest flowers aren't those that withstand the wind. They're those that, even after being plucked, find a way to bloom again. I didn't know what to say. I just hugged her, because I understood she was preparing me, that she was teaching me, once again, without saying it, to let go with love, that she was giving me the final lesson, one that isn't taught with words, but with presence, with that kind of silence that only wise souls can offer. And from that moment on, every second with her became a gift, one I received with open eyes, a willing heart, and the certainty that, when the time came, I would know what to do, because she had already taught me everything, without needing to shout it out, just by living it, by being. The last winter we shared came with a quiet sweetness. There were no storms, no heavy rains, no winds that tore the trees apart. It was as if the world, somehow, knew it should remain silent, that something sacred was about to happen. My mother rose with less and less strength, but her gaze remained intact. It still held that light that calmed the soul, like a candle lit in the middle of a dark room. We spent the afternoons together, wrapped in blankets, looking at old photographs we'd reviewed 1,000 times. Each image was an excuse to tell a story, to laugh softly, to cry without shame. She always said that life wasn't the number of years one lived, but the depth with which one loved. And she had learned that in her own way, surrounded by walls, silences, absences, but also, finally, by reunions. One day, as we ate hot soup and she held my hand in hers, she told me she was ready, not as someone who gives up, but as someone who understands she has fulfilled her mission. She asked me not to cry when she left, to celebrate her life with flowers and songs, not with lamentations. She asked me to return to the village, to take care of the magnolia, to tell her story to anyone who needed it. And, above all, she asked me to live, truly, with my eyes open, with my heart ready, without fear of love or pain. The morning she left was peaceful. The sky was clear. The air smelled of toast and lavender. They called me from the nursing home. I ran without thinking. When I arrived, I found her asleep. A profound peace covered her face. There was no drama, no theatrical farewells, only the meaningful silence that a soul leaves behind when it departs in peace. I sat beside her, held her hand one last time, and thanked her for not giving up, for coming back, for teaching me how to feel. Her farewell wasn't an end, it was a rebirth. In her honor, I turned her room into a memorial space for all the women at the asylum. We hung her letters, her poems, the phrases she used to repeat. We installed a small library with donated books, a mural with flowers drawn by children, a wooden bench engraved with her name, and a sign that reads, "Here blossomed a woman who was invisible, until love made her eternal." I returned to the village, as she asked. I planted new magnolias. I restored the house. And every year, on her birthday, I organize a gathering with people who were touched by her story. We talk about her. We sing her songs. And the wind, each time, seems to dance through the trees, as if it too remembers. Her story changed me forever. And I know it wasn't just for me, Because her voice, her tenderness, her silent struggle became a bridge for thousands. Because when a woman like her dares to remember, an entire lineage awakens. Today, if you're listening to this, I want to thank you for making it this far. Thank you for allowing this story to touch your heart, for looking at those around us with different eyes, for not forgetting that behind every face is a story worth hearing. If you also have someone who left a mark on you, who taught you with their silent love, leave it in the comments. Write their name. Tell me something about that person. Because when we share our memories, we don't just honor those we love, we also heal together. And if this story spoke to your soul, subscribe to the channel. Here we tell stories of lives worth remembering, because every subscription is another flower in the garden of memory we're building together. Thank you for being here. Thank you for feeling. And remember, the next video is already on your screen. Click now and continue walking with us through these stories that heal, that inspire, that remind us that the most valuable things are not seen with the eyes. They are felt with the heart. See you there.